When I was 10, I remember sitting in class while my teacher placed a pair of cups on the table at the front of class. One of those cups was labeled action, and the other was labeled consequence, and these two cups were tied together with a string. She then instructed each of us to move the action cup. One by one, each of us pulled on the cup, and every single time, without fail, the consequence cup would follow. It was a basic lesson in learning that all actions, big or small, always have a consequence. Whether that action be good, bad, or neutral, every action, without fail, has a consequence. With that analogy in mind, let's talk about Webtoon harems, the importance of consequences, and weirdly enough, Brother Bear. I have always loved stories, and since it was particularly hard for me to learn how to read, I usually tended to gravitate towards comics and graphic novels. One of my favorite memories is getting to go to the library as a kid and checking out the newest Babysitters Club graphic novel. They babysit in this one too? So naturally, when I grew up, I found a website that had seemingly endless new and exciting comics for me to read, and I was on board right away. At first, I ate up everything Webtoon gave me without a second thought, but the more comics I read, the more I noticed a lot of the comics on Webtoon seemed to follow a specific pattern with how they were written. Webtoon comics read less like a story being written by a professional author being funded by a major multi-billion-dollar company, and more like a story being told to you by your 4-year-old niece. And then the guy rides in on a pony and kills everybody. And then she's like, I want to marry you. And then she says yes, and she goes to live with him. And then she meets a forest fairy, and she gets kidnapped by these other guys. They're bad guys. And the dragon guy saves her, and then he cuts off the bad guy's head. And then new and young writers can often fall into this trap of writing stories that follow a "and then this happens" mentality, where a series of predetermined events unfolds in the exact order the author wants/needs them to, with no thought of why the characters in the story would actually want to follow those events. If you want a really good example of this, look no further than My Old Outsiders fanfiction. Woohoo! In the story with no name, I can't title things properly, we meet Ricky, a troubled 1960s teen. His mom dies and his abusive stepdad burns his arm. I came to a sudden realization of what he had just done. Ron burned my arm! Why did I write it like that? Ron burned my arm! So he sets off on a quest to find his real dad. It's not, all things considered, a terrible way to start a story. But then we get into the "and then-ing," where Ricky goes to the train station to get on a train, and then a guard almost gets him, and then he gets away, and then he meets Sean, and then him and Sean steal apples, and then they get on another train, and then they jump off that train, and then they find Pap, and then Young writer Maddie never once stopped to consider why, for example, a young jaded kid who has no reason to trust anyone immediately trusts this extremely untrustworthy person he meets on his journey. Why would he stick around him after he impulsively makes Ricky jump off a train? I was just trying to get character A and character B into a location together and then shoot them off into the world so they can be tied at the hip and go on train hopping adventures. Side note, I was reading through some of my old diaries when I was writing this story, and I found a diary entry that was something along the lines of, "I'm really glad Ricky and Sean like me," and I found that really sad and embarrassing. Anyways, this to me is how a lot of Webtoons read like, but again, instead of being written by one self-conscious 15-year-old, they were being professionally published by the largest comic distributor in the world. This was a thought at the top of my mind when I was reading one of Webtoon's most infamous comics. The story of the Princess's Jewels is a story as old as time itself. Princess Ariana wants to be surrounded by hot men, so she sets out to form a harem, collecting men like Pokemon so that she can become the Empress and date a bunch of hot men? Wait a second, if her call to action is to become the Empress to date a bunch of hot men, and the action she takes in order to become the Empress is date a bunch of hot men, then why go to all the effort of becoming an Empress? You already got what you wanted, girl. Why do you need to be the empress now? The story of the princess's jewels is just a series of events and actions with no real consequences to them. Every time Ariana asked a new Vogue-ready man to join her harem, there were no real consequences to it. No one judged Ariana for being shallow and surrounding herself with men. No one told Ariana that she was acting inappropriately and being a bad example to her kingdom. All of these men are also important world leaders or figures, but them coming into the jewel box does nothing? Wouldn't there be some type of backlash or anger coming from these kingdoms because these leaders suddenly left to go do the do with Princess Ariana and just live in a neighboring kingdom? It'd be one thing if that's just how things were in this fantasy kingdom of whatever it's called, but in the opening we're shown that her kingdom follows some pretty traditional old-timey fantasy gender norms. But for whatever reason, Ariana never really seems to run up against them unless it's absolutely necessary to make the plot keep happening. On one hand, she's not allowed to date a lot of hot men because only the emperor can do that. Women can't be the emperor. But on the other hand, she absolutely can date a lot of hot men. Ariana creating this harem should have had an effect on her world. You're going to tell me that this extremely sexist kingdom that refuses to let women rule wouldn't immediately tell Ariana she's being a slut? We've established there are magazines in this reality. Wouldn't there be some type of ridiculous body count counter as a headline here? No one's going to insinuate that Ariana is a tarnished or loose individual in their society. Ariana isn't going to face any backlash for the clothes she wears, saying that she's asking for it. These are all super common occurrences that happen in our world for people with far less social standing than Ariana has. There should have been some type of effect her actions had on the kingdom around her. Why would she need to become an empress in order to date a lot of hot men if, one, she can already do that, and two, she can do that without any major consequences? I've been told that in real life, relationships like this often are extremely time consuming, and if communication is poor, then a lot of partners tend to get jealous of the other partners. You're telling me that these guys are all just okay with Ariana banging one or the other randomly without any set boundaries or scheduling for any of them? There are no consequences to what Ariana does in this comic. She could literally order a man to be castrated and no one will care. She did that, if anyone was wondering.
Well, maybe we could just get together later then, huh?
Oh, I don't think you'll be up for it.
It's very frustrating to be asked to invest in a story as a reader when no action will have any consequences to the story. For example, when we meet Ariana's first choice for her harem, Nell Phantom, we're told that he can transform into a wolf and was able to win the war that the Empire was fighting in. Because of this, his once poor family was able to get out of debt and be seen as a high-class family. But he's still seen as a threat to the kingdom because of his magical powers, and Ariana promises him that if he joins her harem, he will be safe. Within seconds, he pledges himself to Ariana. Not because he values his safety. No, that would make too much sense. He pledges himself to Ariana because he's infatuated by her desire. We don't learn anything more about him, how this pledge affects him, how his family could be seen differently because of it. Nothing. Him telling Ariana he'll be her jewel has no effect on his life or the world around him. No one treats him or his family any differently because he's a concubine, dude? I don't know what it's called, to Ariana. Ariana doesn't get told she needs to save herself for marriage or that he's shallow. She's just allowed to continue doing whatever she wants because her actions have no consequences. Raymond is another character that gets involved with Ariana's harem. This dude literally falls in love with her at first sight and monologues about how great Ariana is. Within a few panels, he's drooling and fawning over her like me with a Dr. Pepper. While Ariana did want him to join her harem, there is no ripple effect his action of joining had on the world. No sadness of how he will leave his home and go live with her. We learn nothing about his wants or wishes other than the fact that he wants to bang Ariana. Raymond was literally appointed to become her concubine by King Gold Blackrose, yes, that is his name, in order to benefit their kingdom, but we never see what those benefits are or why they even needed the benefits in the first place. Why should we care about any of this as an audience if there were no consequences to any crazy or over-the-top action the characters perform? Characters in The Princess's Jewels don't act as if their life has been completely uprooted by the call to action most plots tend to follow. Characters characters seldom bat an eye when their entire life gets uprooted because the lead character demands it. There are no real emotions or story to tell when this happens. Every character will just go along with whatever is happening. Because of this, the story that is being told tends to feel dull and very distant from its audience. Why should an audience invest their time into a story that doesn't really affect the characters in it all too much? If the characters don't care, why should we? I just wanted something to matter. I wanted there to be consequences to the actions of characters. No one teases the princess for being so blatant about collecting men. Will there be an internal struggle with Ariana about juggling so many men at once? Will any of the men realize that they were shallow for falling in love with Ariana at first sight and leave the harem? Do any of their family members miss them? I know I'm asking a lot of a harem comic made for children, but seriously, a plot is not that hard to add. Originally, I had wanted to read this comic for a full synopsis review like I usually tend to do, but it was so nothing. I felt nothing while I was reading it. I had stronger emotions over the last cold I had. I was getting so frustrated with reading the comic, I decided to take a break. I would just walk away from the comic and come back to it later. With my mind made up, I sat down on my couch, ready to unwind and watch one of my favorite movies, Brother Bear. I had grown up loving and adoring Brother Bear, at first for the laughs as a kid, but the more I've grown as an artist and visual storyteller, the more I really adore Brother Bear. Kenai, the main protagonist of the movie, is appointed to hang a basket full of food up for everybody. That way, no bear or animal would come along and eat their future meals. But in his excitement for his coming of age ceremony, he doesn't tie up the basket well enough as he runs off. It falls and spills the salmon everywhere. Kenai sees this. He looks back to where the ceremony is happening and then back to the fish and ultimately decides that fixing the issue isn't that important, and he runs off to his ceremony. At first, this moment seems pretty insignificant, maybe a display of the careless nature of Kenai, but who would think that the basket of fish falling would mean anything in the long run? But as we continue watching, we realize that this moment will ripple out and cause an entire chain of events which make up the entirety of the plot and story. Without the basket having fallen and Kenai ignoring it, there wouldn't have been a story that took place. As you can imagine, a bear gets into the food and eats it, simultaneously carrying off the handmade basket that held the fish. This causes Kenai's brother Denahi to lash out at Kenai for being so careless in the first place. After receiving a verbal beating, Kenai decides that the best course of action is to go after the bear and try to find the basket for Denahi. Something I really like about this sequence of events is the fact that there weren't any high stakes. The tribe the brothers are part of don't seem to be in dire need of food. There wasn't really any desperate need for Kenai to run off after the bear, but rather he was making an effort to prove he was a strong and powerful individual. That way his brother would respect him more. On top of that, it wasn't an accident that the basket fell without Kenai realizing it. He knew what might happen if he left the basket, but he made the decision to leave it, and because of this, there was a consequence. After tracking down the bear, Kenai ends up getting attacked and falling down the face of a cliff. His brothers Sitka and Denahi come to his rescue, but in the fight, Denahi gets stuck, and seeing the only way to save his brothers from the bear, Sitka plunges his spear into the already unstable glacier they are all on, and he and the bear fall to the water below. Because of this, Sitka unfortunately loses his life, and Kenai and Denahi are left to mourn the loss of their brother. While Kenai blames the bear, Denahi tells Kenai it's not the bear he blames. This causes Kenai to hunt the bear who he believes killed his brother. As I was watching, I realized that each and every action of the character had a direct purpose, and each and every action had a consequence. While Kenai couldn't have known that leaving the basket and chasing after a bear that ate the salmon would have caused Sitka to lose his life, those were the very real and very harsh consequences of his actions. I love every second of this film. Each action had an event that followed it. There were things that happened because of Kenai's actions. Every event in the film happens because of a character's decision or reaction to a previous event. At no point does the film say we need to get the characters to go here so that this can happen. Cause had effect. Action had consequence. When I compare Brother Bear to the Princess's Jewels, I realize that one has stakes and one does not. The string that connects actions to consequences had long been severed for the Princess's Jewels. I felt nothing while I was reading because there was nothing. Ariana introducing this harem to the kingdom doesn't actually change anything. No one really bats an eye at the fact that the kingdom's princess seems to be a shallow person indulging in activities that we as the reader were told were wrong in the story. Each of the newly introduced men didn't care that they were competing for the attention of Ariana against a billion other dudes. There aren't any ripple effects that happen because of Ariana collecting these men. Imagine how much worse the story of Brother Bear would have been if it had followed the "and then this happened" course like the Princess's Jewels does. There would have been no time for the audience to digest what's happening. The weight of losing Sitka would have been lessened for the audience had Kenai just turned to the camera and said, "Man, bears are the worst, and I hate them and miss my older brother so much. I'm going to kill that bear because my anger for myself is actually misdirected towards an animal." It wouldn't have worked. The story and moral wouldn't have been as impactful as it wanted to be because there is nothing to understand on a deeper level. But you know what does do that? Can you guess? If the creators of the Princess's Jewels were in charge of writing that scene with Ariana and her harem, it ultimately would have ended with Ariana showing off what a boss babe she was, and she would have made a new basket and caught all the fish again. It wouldn't have been a way to explore Ariana. It wouldn't have been a way to show the community coming together to fix things. It ultimately would have been nothing. No one could have predicted that an action Kenai did would have had such a ripple effect, but that was the great part of the story. People acted on emotions other than lust. Because of this, there is a consequence to an action, which actually immerses the audience in the story being told to them.
We found out this really simple rule that maybe you guys have all heard before, but it took us a long time to learn it. But we can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words "and then" belong between those beats, you're f***ed, basically. You got something pretty boring. What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word "therefore" or "but."
A really interesting example of this is not your typical reincarnation story. There's a literal hand of the author in the story trying to "and then" the story along, but the characters are reacting in a more "therefore" and "but" way. The conflict of the story is literally actions and consequences versus the author's ultimate non-motivation driven story concepts. There are ripple effects of each of the characters' actions that cause other events to happen in the story. Of course I don't just blatantly hate every webtoon I see. I just ask that there are consequences to characters' actions. I find an easier time reading and immersing myself in the story when there are actual stakes at hand. So what's the takeaway of all of this? Is it, wow, the Princess's Jewels sucks and Brother Bear is such an underrated masterpiece? Yes, and yes. Seriously, go watch Brother Bear. No one talks about it, but I love it so much. I swear I will make an hour-long video if you guys want that. But that's not the only takeaway, or at least I hope not. The main point I'm getting at is if you're creating a story, don't just have your character do things and then do more things. It's incredibly important to have a natural flow of events that have consequences. Stories that have this are incredibly more charming and relatable and will make viewers take to heart what they have read or seen. With every pull and tug of the cup, the second will follow. Sometimes the second cup won't move very far. Sometimes it might whip around because of the force of the action. But imagine how boring it would be if that string was severed and nothing could move the second cup. Why should we care if every erratic action will keep the second cup perfectly in place? The great thing about the cups being connected is that it can tell a story. We can learn from the actions what not to do in order to keep the second cup flowing at a steady and even pace. Thank you so much to my patrons Izama, Roses and Water, Lady Owl Possum, Nowhere to Xander, Icy, TJ, Samintra Williams, Char, Probably an Owl, and Mira. If you would also like a special shout out at the end of each of my videos, as well as early access to my content, you can join my Patreon for only $2 a month.